Hiroshima, August 1945. The city had barely begun its morning, the sun climbing weakly over the mountains surrounding the bay, when Japanese POWs were herded along a narrow, dust-choked path leading toward the heart of the devastated city. The air was thick with smoke, ash, and a faint metallic tang that clung to their throats, making each breath a laborious effort. Among them was 22-year-old Hiroshi Tanaka, a former infantryman captured during the Okinawa campaign. He had imagined Hiroshima would show the scars of war, perhaps shattered windows or bombed-out streets, but still retain its structure, its people, its heartbeat. Rumors from the front lines had whispered horrors, air raids, firebombings, but nothing could prepare him for what awaited. As the POWs approached the city center, Hiroshi's gaze fell on the first unmistakable signs of the atomic devastation. Flattened wooden houses reduced to kindling, steel frames bent into grotesque shapes, and streets coated in a thick layer of ash and debris. The city did not breathe. It seemed suspended between silence and the lingering echoes of a cataclysmic flash, as if time itself had paused in horror. The POWs had expected destruction, yes, but this was unlike anything any of them had imagined. Entire neighborhoods were obliterated, leaving behind empty lots where families had once lived. Parks turned into ash-strewn voids, and streets transformed into twisted rivers of rubble. Buildings that had once been homes, schools, and offices lay charred and skeletal, their occupants gone or unrecognizable. Scorched children's toys peeked from piles of debris, fragments of innocence melted into ash. As Hiroshi stepped carefully over warped beams and shattered tiles, his stomach churned with nausea and disbelief. He had been trained to see the enemy, to face soldiers and strategy, not to confront the absolute erasure of a city, the obliteration of thousands of lives in a single flash. Corpses lay unclaimed, frozen in gestures of panic or desperation. The POWs moved silently, their eyes wide, each footstep heavy with the weight of witnessing this unimaginable aftermath. Bridges they had crossed countless times were now skeletal shells. Railway tracks twisted into chaotic loops of molten iron. Each step, each inhalation of acrid smoke reminded them that Hiroshima had been consumed by a force beyond comprehension. The further the prisoners went, the more horrifying the scene became. They passed once bustling markets, now littered with burnt goods and shattered signs. Streets lined with the remnants of bicycles and vehicles twisted as if by invisible hands. The air was filled with a metallic, chemical stench, mingled with the faint smoke of fires that still smoldered in pockets across the city. Hiroshi noticed walls where charred photographs clung to crumbling plaster, their images of smiling families now barely recognizable. A woman knelt in the middle of a street, sifting desperately through rubble, her hands trembling, her eyes hollow with shock. Even hardened soldiers, used to witnessing death and destruction, felt the surreal terror of a city annihilated not by conventional bombing, but by an invisible, instantaneous force. It was as if the city itself had been vaporized in some areas, leaving only ash, scorched earth, and a sense of utter finality. Each block they traversed told the same story. Hiroshima, a city of life, culture, and family, now a landscape of horror, silence, and despair. Hiroshi's mind struggled to process what he saw. Every ruined street, every mangled building seemed to accuse him and his countrymen of failure, not in strategy, not in combat, but in surviving the unimaginable consequences of technological war.
Survivors moved slowly through the ruins, searching for relatives, belongings, or anything recognizable, their faces smeared with ash, soot, and exhaustion. Children, too young to comprehend the event, wandered aimlessly, their movements hesitant, their eyes blank with shock. POWs were instructed to observe, but not intervene, forced to bear witness to a suffering that was total and indiscriminate.
They could not fight, they could not save, and they could not change what had happened. The horror of Hiroshima was absolute, its scale beyond what any soldier had been trained to understand. Each moment the prisoners walked through the streets, the magnitude of destruction seemed to deepen, the realization that thousands had perished in an instant weighing heavily on them. Hiroshi felt a cold, oppressive sense of awe and guilt, knowing that the city he had once thought he understood was now beyond recognition, erased, and mourned by those who remained. Even the physical environment betrayed the violence. Trees were reduced to blackened stumps, paper and cloth fused into brittle, shiny sheets, glass melted into puddles on the streets. The river that had once bisected the city flowed sluggishly, its surface littered with debris and ash. Buildings of concrete and steel, meant to withstand conventional bombings, were flattened or twisted beyond recognition. Fires smoldered, releasing choking smoke that made the sun appear dim, filtering through a haze of chemical smells and dust. Hiroshi noticed the warped remnants of bridges and rail stations, structures that had been central to civilian life and transport, now twisted and uninhabitable. The city had become alien. Familiar paths led only to destruction, and every corner reminded the POWs that Hiroshima had been transformed into a ghostly landscape where life had been abruptly silenced. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers who had faced death in combat could scarcely grasp the scale of indiscriminate annihilation, nor the helplessness of civilians and POWs caught in its sweep. The POWs were silent, their eyes wide, as they took in the scale of devastation. Smoke continued to rise from fires that smoldered in pockets across the city, curling like dark fingers into the hazy morning sky. The streets were littered with debris, personal belongings, books, shattered pottery, melted utensils, all coated in a thick layer of gray ash that crunched beneath their boots. Hiroshi Tanaka, moving cautiously among the others, saw faces he knew among the dead. Neighbors he had trained with, acquaintances from his village, even strangers whose lives had been extinguished in a moment, reduced to unrecognizable shapes in piles of rubble. The psychological shock was immediate. He realized, painfully, that the war he had fought for his country had created monsters not only on the battlefield, but in the very heart of its cities.
For the first time, he understood the full, horrifying potential of atomic power, a force that spared neither soldier nor civilian, POW nor citizen. Each man among the prisoners felt the same choking mixture of fear, guilt, and awe, the unspoken question of why and how humanity could allow such devastation hanging heavy in the air. As they walked further into the heart of the city, Hiroshi noted the skeletal remains of the Iowa Bridge, its once symmetrical arches twisted and bent like discarded metal, scorched black where the fire had licked at it with unimaginable heat. The ground surrounding the bridge was scorched and cracked. Glass from nearby buildings melted into the pavement, forming sharp, glittering shards that reflected the dim light. The river that had once run calmly beneath it now flowed sluggishly, tinged with ash, carrying fragments of wood and paper that floated like ghostly debris. Smoke and a faint chemical odor clung to the air, stinging eyes and throats. The POWs were herded past the remains of hospitals, schools, and temples, their facades obliterated, interiors unrecognizable. Hiroshi could see evidence of the atomic heat everywhere. Wood reduced to charred, splintered frames, paper, clothing, and books fused into blackened, sticky sheets. pottery cracked and distorted beyond repair. Even nature seemed to have recoiled. Trees were stripped bare, bark blackened and leaves turned to ash, while the once lively streets of market stalls and shops were emptied and silent, as if the city itself had inhaled and held its breath, waiting for the dead to speak. The deeper they moved, the more horrifying the tableau became. Hiroshi noticed remnants of bicycles twisted over piles of rubble, the frames molten and deformed. The POWs passed through residential districts where entire blocks had vanished, leaving only jagged outlines of foundations and chimneys that had once punctuated the skyline. Occasionally, a survivor appeared, gaunt, soot-covered, moving slowly with hands trembling, searching for loved ones or anything of value.
Children wandered aimlessly, their eyes blank with shock, seemingly too young to comprehend what had occurred. Every corner revealed more fragments of life: a scorched doll still gripping a melted toy gun, a family photograph fused to a warped window frame, the faint imprint of someone who had run, then disappeared into fire and ash. The psychological toll on the POWs was profound. They were trained to witness death in combat, but this was different. This was absolute, indiscriminate destruction, a force that left no margin for heroism, survival, or resistance. Hiroshi's gaze fell on the remnants of a small temple. Its roof collapsed, statues melted or toppled, incensables cracked and empty. He could almost hear the echoes of prayers that had been silenced, the rituals of daily life erased in a single instant. Fires still burned in pockets, releasing choking smoke and pungent chemical odors. The streets were uneven with debris. Every step demanded attention, lest they twist an ankle or fall into a fissure torn open by the blast. The POWs moved as a group, their footsteps hushed, each man absorbed in the enormity of what they were witnessing. It was impossible not to notice the contrast between this desolation and the city Hiroshi had once known, full of energy, laughter, and the rhythm of human life. Now, everything was frozen in a moment of horror. A city paused forever at the instant of its destruction, bearing witness to an event that no one among them could fully comprehend. Even as they trudged on, the sheer scale of the atomic bomb's effect became clearer. Once bustling intersections were reduced to ash fields, lampposts twisted and melted, store signs warped and unreadable. Hiroshi caught glimpses of what had been family homes, interiors visible through gaping holes in walls, their belongings charred beyond recognition. He noticed a partially intact piano, its keys melted and fused, sitting like a monument to the lives that had been lived there. Occasional cries of survivors pierced the heavy silence, but even these sounded muted, almost surreal against the backdrop of ruin. The POWs' minds struggled to process it all: the war, the sudden erasure of so many lives, the incomprehensible destructive power, and their own helplessness. No words could capture what they saw. Each man felt the weight of being witness to history's most horrifying moment, their emotions tangled between horror, grief, and a strange, numbing awe. In the midst of this nightmare, the POWs encountered civilians who had somehow survived the initial atomic blast. Their eyes were hollow, sunken deep with exhaustion and shock, and their clothing hung in tatters, coated in dust and ash. Faces smeared with soot revealed streaks of tears, dirt, and burns. They moved slowly, staggering as though gravity itself had grown heavier. Each step a laborious effort through debris and broken glass. Some searched desperately among the ruins for family members, while others scavenged for anything that might be useful. A bowl, a blanket, a scrap of metal, remnants of a life that had been abruptly stolen. Hiroshi Tanaka noticed a woman kneeling amid a pile of rubble, her hands shaking violently as she sifted through charred wood and melted belongings. Her face was blank, her gaze distant, as if she had been unmoored from the world. The POWs had been instructed not to interact, merely to observe and report, but the surreal nature of the scene struck them with overwhelming force. These were soldiers trained to fight, to obey, to survive. But here they could neither fight nor save, could barely comprehend the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Hiroshima had become a monument to devastation beyond strategy, beyond control, beyond human comprehension. Each prisoner felt the crushing weight of history in its rawest, most brutal form. The deeper the POWs were led into the city, the more harrowing the scenes became. Streets once lined with lanterns, banners, and the everyday bustle of commerce were now nothing more than open voids of gray ash, eerily silent except for the occasional crackle of smoldering wood or the distant groan of a collapsing structure. Hiroshi's eyes moved over the remains of buildings that had housed shops, offices, and cultural institutions, now reduced to charred skeletons, hollowed and jagged. Every doorway framed devastation, every blackened window a mute witness to the horror that had occurred. Among the ruins, the skeletal frames of bicycles lay fused into piles of twisted metal, telling silent stories of civilians who had fled in panic, many of whom had not survived. In corners and alleyways, remnants of everyday life were strewn across the streets. Charred dishes, melted clothing, scorched books. Children's toys turned to blackened fragments.
The POW's psychological endurance was tested beyond anything they had known. They had fought for an empire, for survival, for honor. But here, honor seemed meaningless, survival miraculous, and the very framework of war they had understood was shattered. Each step they took brought new horrors, new fragments of life turned to ash, and the realization that no military training could prepare a man for witnessing the total annihilation of a city and its people. Hiroshi noticed details that struck him deeply. A tea house, once lively and fragrant, now had its walls caved in and roof collapsed. The remnants of bowls, cups, and utensils were fused together by the heat, unrecognizable. Across the street, a small school lay in ruins, textbooks and desks scorched and scattered, the playground twisted into warped metal and ash. Even objects meant to preserve memories were destroyed. Photographs partially melted to frames, letters fused into black sheets of paper, clothing reduced to brittle shards. Survivors stumbled through these ruins, carrying what little they could salvage, their movements hesitant, haunted, almost mechanical. Hiroshi could see the shock etched on every face, the incomprehension, the grief, the dull horror of surviving an event that had left everything they knew obliterated. Children wandered aimlessly, some clutching charred toys or fragments of dolls, their small faces frozen in a mixture of fear and confusion. Even the air seemed hostile, thick with dust, a lingering chemical tang, and the acrid stench of burnt flesh and materials. Each breath was a reminder of the violence that had swept through the city and of the absolute scale of destruction. As the POWs moved further, they observed the effects of the blast on the city's infrastructure. Roads were uplifted, tiles and pavement melted in places, and signage hung twisted or completely obliterated. Bridges had been warped into grotesque shapes, railways bent and useless. Rivers, once vital arteries, now carried ash, debris, and the occasional lifeless body. In what had once been bustling squares and marketplaces, only shadows remained, traces of human life, frozen in the moment of obliteration. Hiroshi could barely reconcile the Hiroshima he now saw with the city he had known before.
It was as if the pulse of life had been ripped from it, leaving only a husk of smoke, ash, and silence. The POWs were spectators to history's most brutal and incomprehensible moment, forced to bear witness to the aftermath of a weapon they could not fight against,
a devastation so total that it defied understanding. Each man felt a mixture of awe, guilt, and a numb horror, as if the city itself demanded they remember, to carry forward a truth too terrible to forget. Hiroshi and the other POWs were eventually led to what had once been the city center of Hiroshima. The iconic buildings, theaters, government offices, and commercial centers that had once symbolized the city's vitality were gone, reduced to skeletal frames, piles of ash, and molten debris. The landscape was unrecognizable, a moon-like wasteland carved out by a single, unimaginable flash of atomic energy. Hiroshi thought of the soldiers and civilians who had once populated these streets, their daily routines, their work, their laughter, now abruptly halted, many lives snuffed out in an instant. The silence that enveloped the city was terrifying, broken only by distant moans, the occasional creak of collapsing timber, or the rare, haunting shout of a survivor calling for lost family members. Each step over jagged rubble was a reminder that the atomic bomb had not merely destroyed buildings, it had erased the rhythm of civilization itself, annihilated the daily life, and shattered the collective memory of a city. Tears pricked Hiroshi's eyes, but no words came. The POWs, men hardened by combat, stood in mute witness to an atrocity that defied all previous understanding of war, realizing they were observing a new kind of destruction, one that left nothing conventional to fight against. As they moved further through the heart of Hiroshima, the scale of devastation became ever more apparent. Railways had buckled into twisted arcs of steel. Roads were cracked and uplifted as if the earth itself had been scorched from beneath, and vehicles, once vital for commerce and transport, now lay melted and contorted into unrecognizable forms. Fires still burned in isolated pockets, sending black plumes into the hazy sunlight that filtered weakly through the ash-filled sky. Survivors moved cautiously among the ruins, scavenging for food or water, their movements slow, deliberate, and exhausted. Hiroshi noticed children sitting motionless on ash-covered streets, staring vacantly at nothing, their young lives interrupted in a single unbearable instant. Even the air itself seemed hostile, heavy with the scent of burnt materials, charred flesh, and lingering chemical residue from the bomb's unparalleled energy. Each breath reminded the POWs that this was not just a war they had known or imagined, it was something beyond strategy or skill, a destructive force that obliterated the distinction between soldier and civilian, combatant and non-combatant. Buildings that had been the pride of Hiroshima, tall offices and theaters with intricate facades, now appeared as skeletal husks, blackened and warped. Windows were missing or melted, doors fused into frames, and interiors gutted by heat so intense it seemed almost otherworldly. Streets that had once thrummed with commerce and conversation were empty except for the scattered remnants of life. Charred furniture, twisted metal, scorched books, and fragments of clothing. Hiroshi could see families' belongings fused into the concrete or ash, like memory itself turned to stone and dust. Occasionally, the POWs glimpsed survivors dragging remnants of possessions, their movements slow, fragile, and haunted by shock.
Each encounter left an imprint on the men, the knowledge that lives, plans, and futures had been obliterated in an instant, leaving only ghosts of what had been. The prisoners' training and experience offered them no guidance here. This was not a battlefield they could understand, measure, or fight back against.
It was an annihilation that demanded only witness and reflection. The more they progressed, the deeper into Hiroshima's heart they moved, the more surreal the devastation became. Streets they had once known, even from maps or previous reconnaissance, were now unrecognizable. Intersections turned to ash fields, shopfronts to blackened, melted shells, and landmarks erased almost entirely. Fires continued to smolder in abandoned buildings, sending tendrils of smoke into the already dense, sun-tinged haze. Piles of rubble hid countless stories: a scorched tricycle resting against a charred fence, a melted pot beside a collapsed stove, a photograph fused to warped metal. The POWs observed the human aftermath as well, survivors searching desperately, some carrying infants swaddled in ashes, others dragging bundles of clothing, all moving slowly and cautiously. Hiroshi's chest tightened as he watched a small group of children huddled together, staring blankly at a playground melted into twisted metal, their expressions empty, disconnected from the world. The men realized that they were witnessing more than just a city reduced to ruins. They were witnessing the profound, terrifying consequences of a weapon that had redefined war, leaving no distinction between the battlefield and civilian life, no sanctuary from death, no ordinary parameters for survival. Even familiar features of the city had been altered beyond recognition. Bridges twisted into grotesque arcs, once familiar street signs warped and unrecognizable, and rivers carrying ash and debris instead of boats and life. The POWs walked in silence, the sounds of distant creaking structures, crackling fires, and occasional muffled cries their only companions. Hiroshi tried to imagine the flow of life that had existed here just days before. Market crowds, streetcars, children playing, the laughter of families, offices humming with work. Now there was only silence, dust, and the hollow echoes of a city erased.
He felt an oppressive sense of helplessness, the understanding that no soldier, no plan, no training could restore what had been lost. Each step reinforced the incomprehensible scale of the destruction and the fragile nature of human life in the face of such unprecedented power. For the POWs, it was an indelible lesson. War could no longer be understood simply as combat between armies. It had evolved into a force capable of erasing entire societies, leaving only smoke, ash, and the memories of those who survived. Hiroshi and his fellow POWs gradually began to comprehend the staggering human cost of the atomic bomb. They moved cautiously through streets that were once full of life, now frozen in a nightmarish tableau of death and destruction. Families lay in positions that seemed almost staged by the violence itself. Parents clutching children, neighbors grasping at each other, some hidden under debris as if seeking shelter when the flash had torn through the city. The remains of everyday life were suspended in an eerie moment of annihilation. Teacups still on collapsed tables, charred clothing draped over furniture, shoes scattered as though their owners had been frozen mid-step. Each street, each block was a reminder of the immediacy and totality of the destruction, and the POWs felt the weight of it in their bones. Hiroshi's chest tightened with every step. He had trained for battle, for strategy, for the possibility of death among enemy soldiers, yet nothing in his experience could have prepared him for a scene so complete, so indifferent to rank, age, or circumstance. This was a new kind of war, a force that obliterated distinctions and rendered prior definitions of courage, survival, and morality nearly meaningless.
As they continued, Hiroshi reflected on the contrast between conventional warfare and the unprecedented devastation surrounding them. He thought of comrades who had fallen in battles fought on fields and mountains, of skirmishes where strategy, skill, and courage could influence outcomes, and realized that those conflicts were pale preambles to the destruction he now witnessed. The blast had not distinguished between civilian and soldier, youth and elder, friend or stranger. Entire neighborhoods, once vibrant with daily routines, had vanished into ash and molten metal. Schools were unrecognizable, playgrounds warped into twisted sculptures of blackened iron, bicycles fused to the pavement like relics from a nightmare. Hospitals, intended as sanctuaries, lay gutted, their medical equipment warped and blackened, patient records reduced to fragments of charred paper. Even shrines and temples, symbols of endurance and culture, had been stripped to skeletal frames, their sacred statues toppled or melted. Every observation reinforced the magnitude of the catastrophe and the impotence of human preparation in the face of such power. The POWs' senses were overwhelmed. The air carried a thick, acrid mix of smoke, chemical residues, and the faint, metallic tang of ash that clung to their throats and lungs. The sun, filtered through the haze, cast a dim, surreal light over the ruins, giving the city an otherworldly glow that only deepened the sense of unreality. Occasionally, distant moans or the cries of survivors pierced the heavy silence, but these sounds seemed muted, almost as if the city itself absorbed them. Hiroshi saw children wandering aimlessly, some carrying the charred remains of toys, others holding hands with older siblings or parents who had survived, their eyes wide and vacant, reflecting the incomprehensible horror they had endured. Survivors dug through debris for food, water, or personal belongings, their movements slow and mechanical, their expressions hollowed out by trauma. Hiroshi felt an oppressive sense of helplessness. He could see the devastation, but he could neither repair it nor protect the living. Every man among the POWs felt the same crushing mix of awe, guilt, and disbelief, an understanding that this was not merely a battlefield, but an erasure of life itself. As they traversed further into the ruined city, the soldiers began noticing details that made the horror more personal and immediate. Charred photographs clung to warped frames, clothing fused to furniture, toys melted into strange new forms, and remnants of meals sat on collapsed tables. Bridges were warped like ribbons of metal, railways twisted and useless, and rivers carried ash, debris, and occasionally lifeless bodies. The survivors they passed bore expressions of stunned disbelief, some helping each other to safety, others wandering as if guided by instinct alone. Hiroshi observed a small cluster of children clustered around a melted playground slide, their small hands tracing shapes in the ash, as if attempting to reconnect with the life that had been destroyed. He thought of his own family, imagining the shock, grief, and horror they must have faced, and felt a deep pang of guilt. The blast had turned a city into a ghost, a memory of life erased, and these POWs were helpless witnesses, forced to carry forward the knowledge of a destruction so absolute that it defied comprehension. The psychological impact on the POWs deepened with every step. They were trained to endure hardship, to witness death, to survive in war, but Hiroshima offered no framework for understanding or coping. It was a scene of pure annihilation, a city frozen in death, its humanity stripped away, leaving only scorched skeletons of structures, remnants of life, and the eerie quiet of absence. Hiroshi's mind cycled through disbelief, guilt, and awe. He realized that the war he had fought for, the ideology he had served, and the battles he had endured had led only to this, a force that transcended conventional warfare, a destruction that could not be measured by tactics, strategy, or valor.
For the POWs, it was a lesson in the true scale of power and the vulnerability of life. A horrifying confirmation that humanity could create weapons capable of redefining the meaning of war. Each man felt the weight of bearing witness, understanding that the shock and grief of Hiroshima would remain with them forever, a shadow that no battlefield could ever cast, a memory that would define their understanding of destruction for the rest of their lives.